Thank you very much, everyone. We're about to get started with our final panel of the day. Thank you all for making it through. This one is a very special and exciting panel. I am honored to announce Josh Willcox as the moderator for this panel. He's a dear friend. Josh is a senior at the college studying Near Eastern languages and civilizations. He also speaks phenomenal Arabic, so he doesn't look it, but if you approach him after, he'll show you. So, round of applause, please, for Josh and all our panelists, and I'll hand it over to them. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and just really excited for this panel this evening. I know you're probably thinking either this Syrian has really blonde hair, or we've gone back 100 years. It's not either one of those. But just introducing this amazing panel. We've got Khalid Abdalla, a very well-known actor. He graduated from a little less well-known Cambridge in the United Kingdom. You participated in The Square and have acted in many other films such as The Kite Runner and In the Last Days of the City, and more recently playing Dodi Fayed in The Crown. We also have the incredible Omar Samra, who is an entrepreneur, adventurer, and motivational speaker as well. He's particularly famous for summiting the very small hill in the Himalayas called Everest. And he has skied to both the North and South Pole. And then on a more professional basis, he spent and did a career in banking before moving to his new company, World Guanabana, so master name, yeah. Which talks about educational camps and adventure travels. So give it a round of applause for Omar. And finally we have Jehane Noujaim, who is an incredible film producer and director. And she graduated from a small liberal arts college in Cambridge called Harvard. And while at Harvard, you worked on a film with some of your fellow colleagues about the gangs of Roxbury. But then later on in your life, doing some incredible films such as The Square, which Khalid was a part of, The Great Hack about Cambridge Analytica, how my country went down the drain, well, already did, but there you go. And Control Room, which looks at Al Jazeera during the war in Iraq. So it's a big round of applause for you. We'll have a couple of clips during the talk, but I was hoping first that perhaps you three could talk about your experiences first getting involved with this idea of like storytelling. I mean, it's talking about cinema as a catalyst, but the power of a story to change people's minds and perhaps how you first interacted with that. So maybe, I don't know, maybe Jehane, would you like to go first? You got the...
Yeah. Ladies first. So I went to this college, and like every good Arab daughter, I did pre-med, and then quit after organic chemistry, and realized there are other people that should be doctors in this world, and started doing VES, Visual Environmental Studies, which those of you who are at Harvard know, and started doing a photography project. So my interest in film actually began in photography and being censored, because I took a lot of photographs around the Zabali, the garbage collecting village in Egypt, and then did this, I was asked to do an exhibition in Cairo, and a lot of people were very upset by the photographs because they showed very sort of dirty parts of Cairo. I mean, to me, these photographs were about such brave, incredible people who lived with a sense of humor and a love of life in very difficult conditions. But by the end of the conference, all the photographs were taken down, and I hadn't said a word, and I was really kind of blown away by by the power of the image, and by the fact that there were people arguing about whether these photographs should be up or down, or, and you know, I was still in college, I was a junior. So then I took film because I thought, well, if these photographs could speak, that would be really great. And so I started getting into film, and worked at MTV, of course, like all young people who try to go into film were doing at that time. And so we were churning out a lot of crap, very quickly, learning how to film and edit quickly, and then I left MTV to make my own film, which was actually following a Harvard grad named Khalid Abdalla, who started a company called GovWorks, and he was my roommate at the time in New York, and I was just amazed that he was able to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars based on nothing, and that was the beginning of the dot-com era. But I made the film with D.A. Pennebaker and Chris Hedges, who are legends of cinema verite, and they became my mentors and taught me so much. And I really fell in love with this idea that you could make a film, follow people, follow people that you were fascinated by, topics that you were fascinated by, make a film that was both entertaining and could educate. And when I showed Startup.com in theaters, and this was about 2001, I saw how people were able to react and connect with characters and stand in their shoes. And I thought, if I can do that with this film, I could go to a part of the world that I felt was very misunderstood, where I grew up, Egypt and the Middle East, and start making films there about people and how people fall in love with people and stories that I had fallen in love with. And then that took me to Control Room, and then The Square, and then The Great Hack, and here we are. And this is an amazing conversation. Yeah, it's the first one that I've ever had two people that I've followed around and harassed for years to be in one of my films. And that was Dima, who you saw earlier, who I'm sure there's no question after hearing her speak why I became obsessed with her and followed her. We were both in our 20s at the time when I found her at Al Jazeera, and she became a character in Control Room. And of course, Khalid, we met in The Square, and I followed him, and actually the person that followed you the most was Cressida, who became his wife. Always get somebody on the film team that the guy who you want to follow is actually in love with. This is amazing access.
Omar, maybe you want to talk about your first experiences with storytelling. I mean, in the film, which hopefully people will come and watch tomorrow, I was reading one of your interviews, and you talk about how the first thing you're doing is trek across the Atlantic, and it goes wrong, and it was a very near-death experience. And one of the first things you wanted to do was write it down. So, what was kind of the idea behind that idea of storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, I think I got into film by accident. Like every good Arab boy, I went into business, and then realized 4 or 5 years later that I hated it, and my soul was crushed. But I had this parallel thing that I was doing, which I was very passionate about, which was these adventures. And fortunately, because of the business, I could make my own money and I could make my own decisions. When I fell in love with mountaineering at 15, my parents didn't want me to be any part of it. And so, fast forward many years, I'd done a lot of expeditions and adventures on land, which kind of made sense. But one time I was actually traveling to the US, I was sitting next to the window, and I looked outside the window and I see this just vast blue ocean. I turn on a movie, finish the movie, and it's still this vast ocean. And this idea pops in my head, like how amazing would it be to cross that ocean without using a sail or a motor. My rowing partner, whose name is Omar as well, always tells me you should have just finished watching the movie and just never came up with this idea, because I ended up convincing him to come along with me. And we never had an intention to make a film. We just wanted to do this, this great adventure crossing the Atlantic. So we were gonna row across the Atlantic from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean islands. This amazing adventure that we kind of tell our grandchildren about. And since we were doing this great adventure, we thought there's going to be a little bit of spotlight on it, people are going to watch it, so let's use this experience also to raise awareness about the plight of refugees. And so, lo and behold, 9 days into the expedition, we are in a massive storm. Usually storms are good because it means you can row less and the boat moves faster, but this was like exceptionally large, the waves of 7 to 8 meters high and so on. And I was on the oars, the boat flips, capsizes. The boat is designed to self-right itself. It doesn't, the life raft doesn't open, which is literally has one function. It doesn't open. And so here we are, 2 men, unsupported expedition, about 900 kilometers from shore, and in this huge, huge storm. So 13 hours of sort of survival. And we finally get rescued. And this is the question that you asked. We were just somehow compelled. I had no notion that we'd ever make a film. But there was a feeling that what we had just experienced was somehow profound in our lives, or something significant that if we slept and woke up the next day, we'd lose half the details. And I remember just me and Omar just being so tired and so exhausted after the rescue. And I remember there was like a 4% battery on my phone because we couldn't get access to like pen and paper. And we're just crazy, just typing everything. And you know, we were rowing, I was on the oars, he was in the rescue, he was trapped in the cabin, so I didn't know what happened to him, he didn't know what happened to me, so we were filling in the details, writing everything. And I remember reaching the absolute last moment of where we were sitting, like, you know, because in the story and now we're sitting writing our story, and I just finished writing the sentence and the battery dies. And we thought nothing of it. And then a couple of months later, we're in the, because we were doing this to raise awareness for refugees, so we were working with UNHCR, we're in the UN office, and they asked me, so what happened? And I was like, you want the short version or the long version? So, long version. So like 2 hours later, I finished telling the story, and there so happened to be a director in the room who'd been working on making refugee films and so on. And he says, if you allow me, I'd love to tell your story, and I'll take it to Cannes Film Festival in May, and it was January, and I was like, this guy is nuts. But if he wants to try and do it, yeah, let him knock himself out, and so he did. So just kind of how it started, and it's just been a really cool journey. This was in 2017, the expedition, and and the movie still somehow it's survived COVID, and it's kind of had a release in the Middle East, and now after this I'll be in New York and LA. Hopefully the movie's going to be in the cinemas there as well. Yeah.
You want me to answer why the relationship with stories or the relationship with film, or both?
You choose.
It's funny, it's interesting. I just want to say, first of all, it's amazing to be in this room. I've said this to a number of people who I've just bumped into, but it's, in my experience as a diaspora Arab who's now 43 years old, I have not ever been in a space like this. So congratulations. Of course it's sad that these are the circumstances that in some ways bring us together with this force of energy, but thank God we're here. Yeah. And that's my way of saying that I can tell the story in a slightly different way to how I normally would. I mean, my relationship with becoming an actor is that I had a teacher at school one day who came up to me when I was 15 and told me he thought I'd be good in this play that he was doing, and I told him he was mad because I hadn't done anything since I was 5 or 6. And he said, never mind, I think it'll be good. And I went and auditioned, and I got this amazing part, and from the very first rehearsal I fell in love, just completely in love. But if I really go deeper, and this is where I can tell the story in this room, the love of the storytelling and the depth of the understanding of it really came from the environment in my family home. And I'm going to do a shout out to my grandmother here. Tamsiliyat Ramadan. So my father is a big lover of film. And we have this, it's the size of 2 wardrobes of VHSs from, I guess from the 80s and 90s, that has grown over time. And before there was satellite, my grandmother, bless her, Allah yarhamha, would sit and record the tamthiliyat on the VHS player that my father had installed in Cairo, and record the tamthiliyat and press pause when the adverts came on, because they were very long and my father couldn't watch them. So that my father then, when they would be shipped all the way over to London, whenever it was, he could sit there and binge watch the whole 30 days in 3 days. And I grew up with that size of meaning, both of what film, I mean, not just the tamthiliyat, but the size of what film kind of meant in my family environment, but also the size of what it meant even for that, you know, to have access to your stories, you know, and for that whole journey. When I think of the love and what that meant. And then I'd say on the other side, just because it's so relevant to here, you know, because as soon as you start working as an actor or you start entering that world, I grew up in a world in which I was acutely aware of the massive difference between my experience of Arab culture and my experience of my identity and how I saw it represented. I'm lucky in some ways that as I entered the beginning of my career as not career, but my journey, because it was when I was still a student, my journey as I guess I was essentially white passing. And I was experiencing a world that seemed to me to be able to be colorblind in an educational context, at least sufficiently. But I entered university, the other Cambridge, in 2000. I was there over the years of 9/11, and I exited university. I left university in 2003, the year of the beginning of the war in Iraq. And that's where my journey in film begins.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really powerful place to leave it, because I think we wanted to show, I think if you can, it's a video, they all have really simple names, the video. Control Room 3 video. But maybe you want to talk about this just a bit.
Protesters I talked to before I left were very concerned literally for their lives if they left that square.
Should we,
Yeah.
You got the one where the journalist, so Control Room Baghdad,
It's
where the journalist is killed?
Yeah.
So this is obviously very relevant to this period of time when we're watching what's happening to journalists in Gaza. And this was 22 years ago, when this was right before the US troops entered into Baghdad. And what was quite obvious was there was an attempt to not have any coverage. And this is what happened to one of the Jazeera journalists at that time.
I received a phone call from our correspondent in Baghdad saying that there's a big fight around our office in Baghdad. So I put them on air live, and we heard everything, all the fighting going on, but none of our correspondents was able to go on top of the roof so as to be with us live, because they were saying it was too dangerous. But they said if we can sneak out, we can try to manage it. At 6:47, the camera that was filming got stuck with the picture of Tariq Ayoub on the roof. شيل الكاميرا شيلها عن طارق، خليها على الجو.
طلع الدمر على الجو على المكان التقليدي عمك.
I shouted at them, telling them to move the camera out of the face of this guy because he has nothing to do with favorite fighting. And they moved the camera.
كمان كيف الصورة عندك الآن دخل شيء؟
10 minutes later, I was on the phone with the other correspondent, and he said there's a plane turning over us, and now it's coming towards us, and he said, picking down, nose down, which means formation of attack. And the American plane came and launched the missiles against our office. The explosion killed our. When you announce that one of your staff was hurt, you expect phone calls from the families of all these reporters and camera. We received only one phone call from the wife of Tariq, saying, "What happened to Tariq?" We told her, "You didn't say it's Tariq." She said, "I know, my heart tells me it's Tariq, and something happened to him." What can you say, Tariq? So, it was a hell of a morning. Everybody was crying. And so, you can see the tears flowing in, except me. I managed to stay firm, not to cry because it's too easy. For me, that was a crime that should be avenged, or at least investigated.
I mean, maybe, especially thinking about that, even whilst many of us, like undergrads, have been here on campus, I remember the morning of waking up and seeing the news about Jehane Noujaim, and then thinking about the past couple of months and seeing just the amount that journalists have been targeted in Gaza. Perhaps it would be, interesting just to hear what you think about the power. If they're being targeted, there is a deliberate attempt to eliminate these voices, right, that are speaking against these things. What is the power of that narrative and storytelling for you guys in your work?
I think it's very important that it's not whitewashed. And I think that the fact that this was a part of the film, Tara Ayub's wife, we had a conversation later on, and she said, people have continued to call her and talk with her. Now, I just asked Dima whether anything came of any investigation. She said no. And I'll be curious to see what happens with, now there is more of an ability to investigate, but there's also, with AI, much more of an ability to target. And I've been working with journalists on the ground in Gaza, and they have been discarding their SIM cards, having other people with, different names, buying their SIM cards from different areas than where they're located, giving them SIM cards, and then they'll make one phone call, and they'll receive a phone call from the IDF saying, "Yusuf, we know where we know where you are, and please, do not cover in this." I don't know if they're saying please, but don't cover in this area. We know where your family is. It's psychological warfare as well as physical warfare that is happening now. So 22 years later, the ability to target and silence journalists has gotten even stronger. And the number is not, I don't know how many journalists were killed in Iraq, but there was a few. And we're at, I think, over 134, I think is the number right now, which is, no words for that. And this is where, I mean, Dima had a very, for those of you who were here, had actually a very positive response to the fact that Israel had not allowed foreign journalists to come in, which is that you have people who are, you know, coming forward and becoming citizen journalists and becoming journalists who are able to continue to tell the story on the ground and on social media, and able to change the narrative in a way that I have never seen in my lifetime. And that is actually quite incredible, despite what it's taken to get there, which is a horrific amount of blood and amount of death. But with a younger generation of people that are on social media versus an older generation of people who are not, you're seeing a real change that I have never seen before, and that is a tribute to the very brave people that are on the ground reporting.
Yeah, I was thinking, you know, Khalid, if you could talk perhaps about that similar thing in terms of many of the roles that you're like playing in your films. The idea is that through playing this role, that in some ways it might, you know, change people's perspectives on things. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk a bit about that as well.
Yeah, as an actor, you're in a, I mean, I'm not only an actor, there are many other things that I do, but as an actor specifically, you are, you're captive. You are in the narrative position, you know, you are the one that is auditioned. You're not the one who is doing the auditioning. When the story has already been written, when it has been financed, when they've finished pre-production and they're getting ready to start filming, that's when they start coming to you. And so in my career, I have been navigating from really 2005, really, in my case, with film, navigating the terrain of how to negotiate with that, if and when to compromise and why, and then and fighting and struggling within the territories that are then open for you, both on screen and off screen, to ensure that the narrative that you feel is the right one is what makes it onto screen. That in my particular case has involved a hell of a lot of refusal. So most of what, the beginning of my career especially, and it's still the case now to be honest, but most of what I do is say no. This is offensive. There's absolutely no way I will do that. And sometimes it's a matter of saying that in the room. And other times it's been stories of doing that midway through the process and all sorts of things. But then it's also been about finding allies in that process. I know that's a complicated word. And also trusting, and this is a big part of the complication of the journey as well, that there is, this is the labour I guess we're all used to, but is the labour of a particular kind of warmth that translates into something effective, at least on the screen. And yeah, I've had to negotiate that in relation to films about 9/11, in relation to films about Iraq, in Afghanistan, in relation to Egypt. And it was a real shock for me that in playing Dodi, and it's not something I expected at all. I mean, originally, before I was asked to audition and I didn't even know what The Crown was, I had when I started to know what The Crown was, I had no desire to be any part of The Crown. It was not something that I was interested in. And I remember actually my parents live near a bus stop, and there was this bus that was going by a few years later after I'd seen the first poster, and I was like, oh shit, are they going to get to Dodi? And then the thought kind of passed by my head, and I was like, no, not me, no, definitely not me. And I'm immensely shocked. I was immensely shocked on my journey with Dodi to find how much, actually I went on a very profound journey. And then what hit me so deeply in the months before the premiere, because the premiere of the last season was in November, so October it happened. And I'd realized from before that one of the things that I was doing with Dodi was that, you know, for the first time after 26 years, this person who also died on that day was finally going to be mourned. And what it means and what the questions that culturally have to be asked everywhere about why, despite the fact that he's been on supermarket shelves and all of that for 26 years, he's invisible. So suddenly he's being made visible, but then I realized, wow, he is one of the first, if not the first, that I can really think of in the history of feature films on this side of the world, where there is a character of Arab background who you get to know and you get to love, not fear. And so when he dies, you mourn him. And he's the first. And that hurt. In the context of thousands being killed, because of exactly what it said about our cultural imaginary on this side of the world, of how it creates the circumstances of what Hassan was speaking about earlier in terms of grievable lives. That's where you suddenly go, wow, that's the, you know, if the arena of what you experience narratively is one in which you never get to know us, and you never get to love us, you only get to fear it, or you get to be suspicious of it, then when we die in our thousands, it's not surprising that you don't grieve us. Or at least, for some people, that's the case. And that, you know, I'm an actor who has, you know, started their career, you know, I've sort of, my career is the post 9/11 world. And, you know, there's plenty that we can talk about later, but it has been an acute experience of what that means to experience that in your body. It's one of the privileges of being an actor, but it's one of the things it's very different.
Thank you very much for that. And I think even talking about that part of the body as well, is that almost like when you're going on many of your expeditions, this idea of even when things are extremely difficult, this ability to somehow gain the strength to push on, to keep on accomplishing what you've set out to do. How do you do that? You know, how do you, you know, you're in these like horrific circumstances sometimes, and yet somehow you're able to find that strength.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm not, you know, comparing like these types of adventures that I've done. It's they're all by choice. So I think you have to get into a certain kind of. I think the ability that you develop over time is the ability to compartmentalize like your emotional experience, and a lot of these things are happening in survival environments, and so you just have to get to a place where you say, you know, I'm afraid, or I'm, you know, I feel very tense, or I can, you know, I'm very mindful of what I'm going through, but this isn't the time to deal with this now. So if, there's lots of examples, whether it's from, expeditions in the Himalayas, but if we talk about the ocean experience, we started talking about it. So these 13 hours, where it actually got dark, they were trying to rescue us during the day, and then, they failed, then it got dark, and so it was a whole kind of terrifying kind of experience that just kept compounding. The only thing on my mind at the time was survival, just getting out of that situation. And I'd learned over time just to take everything else, because there's so many things to deal with, and just sort of put them in a box, kind of, lock it with a key, and then just throw that box somewhere. And I think not the talent, but like what you're supposed to do is that once you are out of that survival mode, you've been saved, or you feel some sort of like, your nervous system is no longer at shock, you're not even in danger, you're supposed to remember where that key is, and remember where that box is, and bring it, open it up, and then like unpack that. And that's the privilege that we had, going on this journey. Obviously, we prepared, we trained, we had the best equipment, but still all of this happened. But we have the privilege to come back from this. After we were saved 2-3 weeks later, we were back with our families, and sort of the long process of kind of healing and recovering from that trauma then started. But we had the privilege of doing them. And so if you juxtapose that, obviously not even, of what's going on in Gaza, where the trauma is just compounding, and there is no ability to kind of deal with it, because everything is still happening. And to think that even when everything ends, how many years, even putting that aside, just looking at, the movie that we made, we were in a way juxtaposing what we went through with what refugees crossing dangerous seas go through. And I think the reason why we wanted to carry this message through the film is because I personally felt very, it was something that I felt very deeply, that this was a cause, and this was a plight that back in 2017 was receiving very little attention. It was like a faceless issue. People were desensitized to it, and so we wanted to kind of push that agenda. But to think that after doing this by choice and having all of this kind of access to all of these resources, to think that going on a journey so harrowing that we sort of like going on a journey like that because you have no other option, and if you get to the other side, your problems are just starting. And maybe we never even get to the place where you can then say, I can draw now a line, my horrific experience is over, and now I'm going to start the healing process. So I think what we were trying to, it kind of sounds weird to say, but the idea of the film really was, I'm kind of giving a little bit of it away, and that's kind of I guess what the director did very well, is that you see us going through this, and you see our families on the other end, not knowing if we're alive or we're dead, and so on. And you hopefully get sucked into this, and you're afraid for us. You kind of get invested. And then towards the end of the film, there is we juxtapose our position with what refugees go through, and it's kind of like guilting people. So if you've gotten to the point of the film where you felt for us, because somehow we're more relatable to you, as but then you see, this refugees going through this, and you feel nothing, or feel a much less sort of level of emotion, then that should give you pause, and you should kind of, ask yourself, like, why is it that I'm not? Is this something fundamentally wrong with me? Is this because of the way the media is? Is this because of, and that's really the conversation that we were, hoping for people to have around the film.
Well, I definitely hope everyone comes tomorrow and stuff like that. I think we'll show a trailer of it just towards the end before we do our Q&A. But I think that actually leads relatively well into maybe doing the excerpt from Khalid. If you could do the square 3 of was the previous one that we had before. But I guess this excerpt is from the protests in Tahrir, and one of the main things that comes out of that conversation is this idea of I need to tell this story anyway, and perhaps even not having a choice. You contrasted that idea of I chose to go on this expedition. Many refugees simply don't have that choice when they're trying to get across the sea. I think that translates politically as well, for some people feeling that there is no way out. You either continue to live under really authoritarian regimes, or you do something, and it's extremely difficult in that way. And I think that would be incredible for you guys to talk about, but let's see if we can get this clip.
I'm going to do what you guys did on that.
The protesters I talked to before I left were very concerned, literally for their lives, if they left that square. The secret police, the intelligence apparatus is still in place, still taking people, and could pick them off one by one when they return to their homes. Khalid, you're a famous actor. Do you worry about talking like you have been, about being in with the protesters? Do you worry that you could be targeted?
Well, I don't care. I mean, I know why I'm here, and I know why I want to be here. I mean, I come from 3 generations who've been fighting for social reform and political freedoms in this country, and here we have the discourse of democracy, of freedom, of social justice, of political reform being changed in the Middle East for all of us, and I'm extremely proud to be here for those reasons. السيد الرئيس محمد حسني مبارك بالتخلي عن منصب رئيس الجمهورية وتكليف المجلس الأعلى للقوات المسلحة بإدارة شؤون البلاد، ونحن نعلم جميعا مدى جسامة هذا الأمر. المجلس الأعلى للقوات المسلحة يتوجه بكل التحية والإعزاز لأرواح الشهداء.
غير مصر بالكامل، أثر في العالم كله. ما عندهاش استعداد إنها تخرس ولا يتقفل بقها ولو لمرة واحدة في حياتها. اللي كسبناه من الثورة كشباب حر هي حرية. كنا بنحلم إن احنا نشوف مصر كلها زي مصر ميدان التحرير. ثورة.
Perhaps you just even want to talk about, for a couple of moments, just even filming that, putting that together, those moments. And
I think, and I urge every filmmaker who's in this room, we're going through another time like this now, right? Because at that point, I had never seen anything like what we experienced in the square, and and I think the goal of a storyteller is, well, let's just say my goal as a storyteller is that I feel like if I meet somebody like Ahmed or Khalid or somebody who teaches me something, gives me hope, I want to share a little glimpse of that person and those ideas with the rest of the world. And I could never pretend to say that I could capture Khalid's whole experience or Ahmed's whole experience, or in any of these films, you're never able to say, okay, it's 100% of that person's experience, but if you're able to put somebody in the shoes of that person and give people a glimpse of what their life was like and a glimpse of what you felt and what you learned, then I think you're able to move people. And again, I don't think films change the world, but I think the people that watch them and that are moved by them can. And I think that is the goal for me of storytelling, is to be able to try to move an audience in the same way that I was moved in that moment. And so in putting a scene like that together, you edit it, you re-edit it, and you watch it, and you hope that you can translate to the screen a little piece of that feeling that you had when you were there. And then you show it to the people that were in the film and say, does this resonate with you? And you hope to God it does, because that's the goal, is to have people feel that, and to transport people in a way that nothing else can transport people besides film. And I think that was the magic that I saw when I saw Penny Baker and who I still consider my mentors. They made films in the 60s in the US about Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, and I felt like when I was watching them, it was like a time machine transporting me to that moment. And I felt like if I could do that, and that was valuable. And I think that is actually what people on the ground right now in Gaza are doing for people, for young people especially. And my hope is that films are going to be made, many films about this period of time, so that it doesn't become part of the 24-hour news cycle and disappear. Because I'm living in Egypt now, and people say now that when they watch The Square, they're reminded of what actually happened, because people forget. You know, and unless you have a record of that time through characters, through people that lived it, I think that's what the power of storytelling and film can do. How did you feel being filmed?
It's strange to see, isn't it? I've got a few things I want to say that are related and not related to watching that, but I mean, one is that when I was speaking to Abdurrahman, we were speaking about this earlier. I mean, for me, that's not then, that's now. And for anyone that lives a moment of political rupture of this kind, it lives with you every day, every morning, and you search for it wherever you can find it. And for me, I feel it here. And I also feel it deeply in the moment of everything that is happening through Gaza. And I would say that what I felt then is what I feel and have felt when I've been alive, in the ways that Palestine makes me alive all the times that I have been in Palestine. And it is the search for a particular form of freedom that exists around the solidarities of justice. And that's what to live for, and that's why when I say those words there, you know, the fundamental, most important, you know, it's a journey. You know, my father was a political prisoner, my grandfather was a political prisoner. Everyone who's here in relation to what's going on in Palestine is part of that journey of 75 years plus. And it's the level of those narrative journeys that we are part of trying to bring together in some way in what we're doing and working on. But the other thing I want to say, which is really fundamental from the experience of that revolutionary period in relation to film and the creative kind of narrative interpretations in general of political events, is I used to think before the revolution that it's like, oh, people make documentaries and people make fiction films and people do journalism and people do writing and people do whatever they do, as if it was like just some abstract thing that comes from people. When living through the revolutionary period and the urgency of those moments, you suddenly realize that each form had its moment of absolute intense necessity. So there is a moment like the one that we're living, for example, now in relation to Gaza, where, you know, the journalism, citizen journalism clip, whatever it is, the form that is quick enough to kind of go, this is something that shows what I want to be able to share with the world. I can get, it happened. Because the world is revealing itself in this particular way. I can just take this clip, do an in, do an out, and share it, and it goes wild. But then what do you do when that moment disappears? You start moving to documentary. The documentary captures the long form of the stories, because not all of the stories are stories that you can just capture an in and an out. And you see a man carrying his child dead body in a plastic bag. You have the longer form of the stories. But then what happens when those stories are no longer live? You move to fiction. And especially when those stories are things which are happening which are invisible or happened in the past and need all of that reinterpretation. So that's on the one side in terms of the formal aspects of storytelling, in terms of its relationship with narrative and what's essential. But each of those, and this is something that I think we've seen over the course of today, each of those has an infrastructure. And if you're serious about doing war or struggle, which is what we're engaged in, over the battle of our narratives, then you have to understand those infrastructures. What was the panel about, about journalism, but at some level a conversation about the infrastructure, whether it's Democracy Now! Al Jazeera Plus, right? Or the New York Times or whatever else it is that is giving us the stories, and how then you have to negotiate or find your ways around it or build your own structures inside it. And I lived a journey during that time in which I was working on, it was a joke. I used to say that I lived 5 years of my life between a film that never ends and a film that never begins. And in the middle of it, made a documentary about a revolution. And during that time, I was also doing the kind of citizen journalism work, alternative media, and Mussolini, and all of this other stuff. And my body was on screen and off screen and all of these different places, experiencing the infrastructure of our stories and what it is to make a film in the Arab world, because that's the other thing. There is no solution to any of our problems without being able to make our own films in our own countries, telling our own stories where we're from. It's impossible. If we're only to make it on this side of the world, we will always be beholden to the gatekeepers that are on this side of the world. And that's not to say that they're not important and we shouldn't work with them and there aren't brilliant people there that we should be with, and who can also even tell stories about us that we can tell with them or whatever. That happens too. One of my favorite films is The Battle of Algiers, and it was made by an Italian. So I do think it's possible, and I do think it's important. But unless we solve the political stuff, which is why we were on there and on the barricades, forget it. It's all of that, at the very least, that we have to reckon with when we're really talking about what we need to do. And just one last thing I'll say in relation to that, in relation to film. Why? Because there is fundamentally a battle over space. This difficulty of us being in a room of us sharing our stories of the reason why in Egypt, if you gather 3 or 5 people, you can go to prison because they decide retrospectively that you should have asked permission. And film is one of the spaces in which the size of a public canvas that is huge is possible. And that's why this particular moment, where we have the real opportunity to walk over the threshold of a change in global consciousness, means we really need all of us to do that work, because if we're not doing it, why the fuck would anyone else? And so we have to take those risks. And that's what I have to say.
Would people be interested in doing some Q&A questions? Yeah? Maybe if we stand behind the 2 at a time? Yeah, I think so.
This mic is not 5 feet friendly. It's like still not working. Oh, sorry about that. Hi, thank you so much for your time and all your thoughts. I think this was a great panel and discussion. I'm not in the film area, I'm in business, but I think this question kind of interlaces with both. So for me personally, I'm still pretty young, I'm 25, a few years into my career, and I think I've been seeing this in all industries at the moment. One thing that I'm getting a lot from is people in the same backgrounds. You know, Arab background, I'm Palestinian myself. There's a lot of censorship even from the community themselves. So when it comes to work and biases, like I personally work for a non-retaliation company, but I'll have people in the team is like, listen, you're way too young to be putting your career out there. You're way too young to be discussing these things. You need to be politically correct and not speak about it. Even though, again, I push it a lot internally, like, hey, my identity is not political. But even the people who come from the same backgrounds aren't supportive, and there's a lot of fear of repercussions, and saying that, okay, you are not in the leadership point at your life at this moment, so you need to be patient. Kind of, what's your feedback in that sense of like pushing the envelope, but also being cautious of your career long term, whether it's in whatever industry you're in? Thank you.
I mean, I guess we'll probably have different answers to this, but I mean, on the one side, I think this is a very personal thing. I don't think there is one rule for anybody. And I think, you know, whether you're in a position in which you are free enough to be able to take a risk and face the consequences of that or not, changes what you're able to do. And I think it's dangerous to have any kind of advice in which whatever anybody does seems somehow diminished. I think wherever you are, you push as far as you can. That's a simple thing. On the other side, from my experience, I guess some of the people in the room know that I've been vocal in ways that many other people haven't. Is my experience is that doing so, you tend to discover solidarities that you didn't even know existed. It reminds me of something that actually I learned from 2011. It reminds me hugely of, I don't know how many people here have had experiences of running in crowds from tear gas, right? But one of the things that happens is you start running, the crowd starts running, imagining that the police is right there and about to get them. And there's a role, which some people have, and I was not very good at being at the front line, but I was good at this thing, which was turning around early enough to look and kind of say, there's no one running. You know. You discover that a lot of it is in your mind, yourself. And I actually think that testing the waters is really very important. People have asked me if I've faced a backlash because of the things that I've done. No. So far, مش عايز أحسد نفسي. بس يعني so far that hasn't happened. And actually what I've found is that by doing so, I have found the people I want to find, and the people that want to find me have found me. And so, this is a moment of, if not, what more can it take? And I think that's, collectively what all of us are feeling. And so, I would say move within that spirit. And I would also say support whoever it is. I don't know what the word for tahween is, but we need as little of that as possible. Because it needs the warmth of the solidarity in order to move forwards. There are those of us who are deeply radical and able to be radical in every different circumstance, and I love those people. But they are not the only people that exist, right? And so we need all of us to work in that. We need all of us working and helping and pushing and trusting and to really go as far as we can. That's my feeling.
Thank you.
I think the question that you ask is at the center of so many people's minds right now, probably every single person in this conference. Do I speak out, or do I destroy and potentially destroy my future? Do I wait till I get to the place where I feel like I have enough power to be able to speak out? But the question then is, I don't have an answer to this question. I don't think anybody does. I think it's you have to choose your battles. You have to reach out to people who have been there before. Reach out to mentors, support each other in these situations. I have a story that is maybe not for here, but it was really a very difficult situation I got in when I won the TED Prize. And I went to Jehane Noujaim, who gave me some very good advice. And at a certain point I said, I don't want this prize. And they bent, and it had to do with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and somebody that I wanted to speak, who ended up speaking, it was somebody who was a refusenik in the Israeli army. And the fight that I went through was really tough, and a lot of risk. But there's other times when it wasn't worth it. And so you really have to choose your battles carefully, and you have to go to mentors. Jehane Noujaim is an Indian filmmaker who has done a lot of work and has faced sort of some similar, she's just you find your wise people. But I also think we're in this moment, and I think if we're not pushing forward at this moment, and we can say, I feel like I can say that having been through a number of these moments, but this is a very important moment where we all need to push.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, I just have a phrase that I hold dearly in me, but I'm like, free Palestine, yes. Also, Palestine will set you free.
Yeah, true.
And that is the experience. We all know in this room how deeply important Palestine is to everything intersectionally that we see in the world, right? And so we really have to live what that path opens up for us. And I can't promise you that in taking risks there won't be consequences, but I can promise you that it will be a beautiful journey that will bring you closer to who you actually want to be. And that is worth the risks.
Thank you so much.
And reach out to us if you find yourself, through this process, I put together a number of WhatsApp groups of people that I know to advise other people. We need each other at this time.
So thank you very much for your presentation and for bringing back the memories from Tahrir Square. It is and it will be always our icon of hope in the most desperate times. But I'm a public health professional, and for me 2011 held another icon, which was the movie Asma, held by Omar Samra at that point. And I cannot tell you, like, in all our campaigns for HIV-related stigma, putting that movie out there will do the wonders. Later on, we wanted to expand this on like several other projects. We did things about female genital mutilation for like small theaters in the local communities. It also did a lot of impact, but my question is, why do you think it stopped at Asma? Like, why didn't this go along with more? And what do you think we need to expand in that industry, like to use the movie for public health awareness and to change public health practices?
In the Arab world? Well, first of all, we need a revolution.
Yeah.
But I'm serious. You can't make films in the way that we are capable of making them in the Arab world currently right now, especially not in Egypt. I don't want to say it's easier in Palestine, but in some ways it is easier in Palestine than it is in Egypt right now. And that's crazy. And so, you know, I made a film called In the Last Days of the City. It took us 2.5 years to shoot and 10 years to make, and there were deep infrastructural reasons for why that is the case. And the answer in some ways to the career question on another level, you know, is what are the opportunities for a genuinely fulfilling life inside these industries that many people would rather be in, you know? Why do you, at some level, decide not to be a banker and go, you know what, my heart is telling me I want to do what's impossible. I find that so incredibly inspiring and beautiful, and I have to say, I find it political. You may not intend it so, but I find it deeply political in terms of how I read it. And so I can't have the conversation about making more films on a public health level in Egypt without facing the political reasons that mean that I can't make a film in Egypt without the army and the police being part of the production. It's ridiculous. At the end of the day, it doesn't, you know. But, and so, البيضة والفرخة يعني البيضة والفرخة. You know, I mean, that's just, it's, and we're all kind of, you know, we're at some level we're captive, again, having to do what we can over here, and this is the case clearly for everybody in this room. You know, having to do what we can over here, but there's just so much that we have to do over there. That's my answer. Sorry, unless there was something, yeah.
Hi, my name is Zaid. I just want to say this panel has been so inspiring for me today. I myself am a filmmaker, born and raised in the Arab world, currently in the diaspora. And I guess my question mostly involves, you talk about reclaiming the narrative and being the authority on making sure we are the people that to properly tell our stories. I guess my question is, how do you navigate that conflict of, you know, having your stories be censored, but also wanting to get your work seen, if that makes sense, and making sure that the stories you're telling are true to your culture and aren't being watered down, if that makes sense?
If I understand you correctly, how do you make sure that you're making something that is true to your culture but that is not being censored either by other people or self-censored?
Yeah, that's correct.
So I think the power is in the specifics, and when you get more intimate, more specific in your storytelling, the more universal these stories become, the more they reach people. You tell a story about your relationship with your mother, everybody around the world is going to be able to relate to it because everybody has that relationship in some way. So that's where I go. That's why, you know, when Cressida became a part of the film team that made The Square, and Cressida is Khalid's wife, and I knew that they were going to be filming some beautiful, intimate conversations about his dreams and his hopes and his, I knew that she was going to be able to bring forth the footage that will touch the heart of somebody halfway around the world who's not Egyptian, who knows nothing about the revolution, because Cressida would be able to find the specificity in Khalid and what really empowers him and what drives him. And I think that that's what you have to do, and that's what you have to do in telling stories that are difficult stories to tell, where you feel like you're about to be censored. And I was saying earlier, I had my roommate, I think I was an experiment at Harvard, my roommate from college was Israeli. And so we've had some interesting conversations since October. But I remember when one of the first conversations we had, I talked to her about, we have kids, I have kids, she has kids. I talked to her about how we were trying to get milk powder. Formula. I blanked out. I had twins, and I blanked out these things. How to get formula to some of the women that needed to feed their kids, and that's what we were trying to. That was a very specific thing that we were trying to do, and I knew that she could relate to that because she had kids, and every mother knows not being able to feed your kid is devastating. So how do you find those very personal, intimate, specific stories that will reach people's hearts?
Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Hassan. I'm Egyptian, born and raised. So thank you again for this panel, really beautiful and inspiring. I couldn't help but shed a few tears when we were playing the scenes from The Square. I wanted to ask specifically about when we talk about telling stories and capturing these moments so that they live on and that it's not forgotten after the moment passes, like you were saying earlier. And specifically thinking about that in relation to Gaza and what's happening right now, and thinking about when something is so horrible and awful and graphic, at what point does trying to humanize these people actually dehumanize them in a sense? And at what point, like, kind of going out of our ways to tell the story of these people in order to appease to the Western audience or actually insult the pain that the people are going through. Like, to give a specific example, I think Khalid, you mentioned the example of the father carrying the remains of his children in plastic bags. Yeah. I wonder at what point is us perpetuating those images and that graphic picture is commercializing something that is so terrible and awful and graphic. And that's something that I personally have shared this picture a lot of times and this video, and something that haunts me. But I still wonder about that question of at what point is it actually insulting to try to go so much out of our way to show that something so clearly awful is awful. I wonder how you think about this question.
I mean, it's not the same in any way, but we had this challenge when we were looking at like our documentary, and I know it's a very different thing, but we were looking at the plight of refugees, and we were looking at the movies that have been made before. And one of the most successful films was called Human Flow. I don't know if anyone's watched it, but it's a very heavy film. And it struck us that when we started doing the research and talking to people, we realized that the only people who watched it seemed to be people who already massively invested in the plight of refugees. So either they worked within the field or were somehow just, it was a very small amount of people. And so ultimately it came down to like, what was the objective of the film? And the objective of the film for us was to reach this other bunch of people who were not invested at all, didn't feel anything. And so and I think that was probably one of the rationale why, because we didn't set out to make a film. The director kind of found the story and then asked us if he could write the film. And I would imagine that about what's happening now in Gaza, I'm sure many films will come out of this, and they will, the films will approach the story in many different ways. In this specific instance, our story is ultimately a story of high adventure. And we managed to sort of in a clever way use that as bait, to kind of lure the audience into a movie that's kind of entertaining, that the beats of the film are kind of fast. I talked also about like having people to get emotionally invested in us as a sort of a way to have the payoff at the end. But the way I think about it is, and I'm not a filmmaker by any means, but I was thinking about it as, I think having the objective in mind. So, you could make a film that's purely an art piece, a beautiful body of work, and that could be the objective, and that's a very successful movie. But then if you're set out with the intention of, I want to win hearts and minds, and I want to change people's minds, and people who are, have a very different view of reality, I want to get to those people, then maybe you have to employ other ways, and it won't be what you were saying. It won't be like to be extremely graphic, because people who have an hour or a couple of hours to watch a film that are not invested in the story, or probably don't want to sit through a film like that. And so I don't know what the treatment would be, but in our case, for example, we found a way to have something that is kind of an element of, it doesn't work obviously in the Gaza narrative, but in what we were doing, there was kind of an adventure, sort of entertainment value that got those people who are not invested engaged, and then we thought very carefully of how to deliver the message to them to capture like what we wanted. I don't know if that in any way kind of answers a bit of your question.
Something very quickly. I think I can relate it to men making Control Room. We were sitting in the States, and I mean the ridiculousness of weapons of mass destruction, and we're going to bomb these people into democracy, and shock and awe. I don't know if anybody, maybe nobody was alive at that time, but anyway, it was unbelievable that this is what was coming out, and so I wanted to be, I wanted to show what was actually happening on the ground through the footage of Al Jazeera. But there's no way that you can show that to people and expect to have people, can't just watch this stuff, right? I mean, especially when there was no YouTube at the time. Everything that they were seeing was through CNN, NBC, and it all looked like very surgical it looked like a video game, actually. When you saw mainstream news coverage of the Iraq War. So it was a bit strategic to go to Jazeera because everybody thought that bin Laden was like walking around the hallways of Jazeera at the time, those videotapes were coming out, and so they thought, so it was using that, people's sort of curiosity about the channel in order to get to another place, and then finding characters or people who had a sense of humor. Would make the translator. There was the Iraqi translator was translating Bush. The Jazeera Iraqi translator who we followed was translating Bush. His name was Muwafaq, and he would just make faces and yell at the screen, after he was translating him, and. So you have to find those, as a filmmaker, you have to find those moments that are going to make people laugh, that are going to be, frankly, which is hard to say in a situation like Gaza or a situation like the Iraq War, but you have to pull people in different ways, and then they have them open enough to be hit with the horrible reality that they need to see.
Just to add, images have an ethics, and they also have a function within the battle of narratives. And so it depends which narrative, and this is something that is shifting and moves according to what point you are in the battle of the narrative, right? So when you are at a moment where people are saying this is not happening, then the function of that image and its value at that moment becomes to say yes, it is. And to relate it back to Egypt, we lived that moment in a journey, right, in which they were saying, oh, the army doesn't torture, so then you show proof that they torture. They would never do this, oh, they do this. But there comes a moment, which came with us, with Rabah, where they want you to know that they do this. At which point that image has a totally different function and different value and different ethics. And in relation to what's happening in Palestine, we have been through a journey of different moments. Let's not think of this all these last 6 months of one moment. You know, we have been through many different moments in which the function of the image has changed, and what kind of images and stories are most valuable, and therefore, going back to what I was saying, what form of storytelling. However, I'm haunted, and this goes back to something again that Abdulrahman was saying earlier, and empathy has come up. I'm haunted, I'm sure a number of people here will have seen this. I'm haunted by a man who I believe was a doctor, who had to amputate his daughter on a table without any anesthetic and dirty water. And held up the camera as an act of witness to what he was experiencing. And I find the violence in that image, not just the circumstances he was living, but that he turned the camera on in the hope that someone would see it, and that it would break through into a gaze of him that would humanize his experience for them. It's deeply, to me, deeply heartbreaking. And of course, at some level, that's a sort of metaphor of what we live in a kind of wider sense. But the attempt to reframe it, I think that the image is all about, at some level, how you frame it and where it sits in the story. Anyone who's worked on a film or edited it, something that they've written, will know that it resonates differently depending on how you place it. And yeah, so the ethics of how you handle the image is a big part of what the image in the end becomes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I think we've come to the end of our questions. So I think maybe come down after we just after we finish, just because they're but I think we're going to watch the trailer for Beyond the Raging Sea, and then we'll finish up the talk. So hopefully they've got the trailer back there. It's playing tomorrow. End of the day.
There are actually more people that have gone to space than have rowed across an ocean. So we decided to do it.
He gets a phone call from Omar Samra, who tells him, hey,
I want to do this thing. I want to row across the Atlantic. We had no experience. There was so much to learn.
Two guys who really have no idea what rowing is about.
He's done 7 summits. He's worked to both poles. I think this looked like a very reasonable next challenge to go.
It was a challenge that we wanted to raise awareness about the plight of refugees. What we didn't know is how close our stories would become.
It's actually a good naivety to not know what's coming. there isn't anything else that's like this.
What happens if you get injured? What happens if I'm weak? What happens if I have this issue or that issue? What do we do?
And then very quickly, just things started to compound. Waves get bigger, wind gets stronger. If something happens, it's finished.
You could feel that pressure build. It's 7-8 meter waves crashing. It is chaos.
You know, what would I tell his family? It becomes just very clear that this is now just about us.
No matter how much you think you understand, nothing will compare to the real thing.
It's almost like my entire life led up to that one moment.
I just found myself calling his name out. Omar, where are you? Till this very day, it hurts remembering the feeling.
If we can give one more huge round of applause to all of our Thank you very much.